We're live. Yeah. All right. Okay. There was a still there of you drinking water. So, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. Okay, perfect. So we're live. Well, welcome back, and sorry, Matt, for the difficulties that I encountered last week. My computer was. I updated my computer, and not realizing that doing so could really foul things up on my hard drive, and so fortunately, uh, things are okay. Fortunately, things are okay. Anyway, so here we are discussing chapter 17 this week. But before we do, Matt, how are you? How's everything? And any poetic news? Any updates on other fronts of your life that you might want to address briefly before we tackle chapter 17?
No, things are going good. Just trying to secure more reviews and trying to secure outlets for those reviews.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, I don't know, people are kind of like winding down for the holidays, so I don't know
Yeah.
if what I'll be able to do from here on out. But I really think the end of this month, and the beginning of next month, are really it for mowing this grass. After that, I'd start focusing on the next book, and then whatever comes after that. So I'm really trying to get that.
Okay.
Who knows? I'm seeing that, but then who knows? So lots of work.
All right. Well, uh, I'm so excited to be. I'm so excited to be talking about chapter 17 because I've given it a lot of time and attention, and reading chapter 17 for our meeting today is the first time that I read chapter 17. So I have to say that I was initially challenged because of his discussion of ratios and comparisons. And actually, let me share what I wrote in preparation for today's discussion, and it goes like this. If I was to give my understanding of chapter 17 an evaluation, it would be just a bit above average, though I have certainly given its reading and comprehension great effort. I've read the chapter some 2.5 times. I've taken notes on it 3 times, and I've consulted outside materials and taken notes on those materials as well. The initial obstacle was to recall the explicitly and the implicitly identified terms and figure these terms appropriately within the equations, algorithms, and ratios that Marx presents to illustrate his more general distinctions between economy. To really understand Marx, the historical economist who writes chapter 17, then one does well to understand David Ricardo's political economy. So that there's before I go into this next segment, in fact, maybe even before I ask for your thoughts on chapter 17, there's this general divide, right? And it is the divide that exists between Marx's sort of political economy, really historical economy, and preceding political economic work. And the distinction rests, as I've come to understand reading chapter 17, and in fact, all the other chapters that I've been reading along the way and turning to over the last 2 weeks actually, to understand chapter 17. The primary distinction is that Marx is incorporating historical factors into the kind of equations, right, that preceding political economy was ignoring, was inattentive to. I'm reminded in this case of Marx's critique of Aristotle. He lands that same critique upon contemporary philosophers of the economy, right, to distinguish himself and to distinguish his project from others that are inattentive to themselves within the historical moment. Matt?
Well, I mean, I'd have to look at the specifics, because there's so many critiques in there that he has of other economists, philosophers of economy, or what have you. To look into it specifically, but the major difference is that Marx is saying that is looking at the kind of the shape of things and saying this is wrong. That there's wrong with this. And it's not just not just looking as kind of an observer, like, well, when this happens, that'll happen, and this happens, and that'll happen. If this happens, you can guarantee that. I mean, I remember reading a lot of people were talking about how in recent times how the Arab traveler and philosopher Ibn Khaldun actually predates some of what Marx was pointing to and some of what Darwin was pointing to, some of what all kinds of people were pointing to. But if you read Khaldun, I remember the part where they talk about Marx. He talks about an increase in an increase in like productivity brings an increase in population. I think he didn't use those words. He used words like an increase in handicraft, increase in craft, brings an increase in civilization, by which he meant population. So he was talking about how like city states grow, right? But there was no critique of that. There was no like, and this one guy's getting rich and everyone else is like dying. No, it was just like basic observation that as this happens, and this happens, and that happens, and this happens, and that happens. And it was very brilliant in how he was able to break it down. But there was no criticism of it. It was simply stating that this is what happens when this happens, what happens. But essentially, with the economy and the ability to feed people, the ability to move water around, the ability to produce goods and necessaries, the ability to do these things. The more you do that, the more your population will grow, the more this will happen, the more that will happen, the more that will happen, right? And so that's what a lot of philosophers or economists before that predate Marx were kind of pointing to. And, Marx goes into it. What's so interesting about reading Kapital, particularly reading Kapital, is that Marx in general, but what's really interesting about reading Kapital is how he's very conscious of what people will say to discredit what he says, right? That's why the book is so long, is because like in every like preceding chapter he says, okay, I don't mean this, I do mean this, I don't mean this, and obviously when this happens is when. So he actually like writes in as many of what we call exceptions to the rule before he actually gets going, right? So he writes all these different possible exceptions that you may come up with to try and like discredit what he's saying before he actually goes about saying it. So in the beginning he talks about the natural differences between like an adult worker versus a child worker, and this versus that, and in order to like say like, so we're not figuring for that, we're figuring for this, and this. And so I mean that's always interesting to me, like how he writes in ahead of time, already addressing what his critics and naysayers might actually say. I'm not so sure that that's good writing, but at the same time, I see the necessity of it. So that was kind of interesting.
Well, he's a polemicist, to be sure, and he is separating the wheat from the chaff, as the saying goes, and must beat folks to the punch in order to make way, for his project. I'd like to say that what this chapter does is frame time in terms of the length of the working day, frame exercise, human movement, right? As far as the intensity of labor is concerned, and frame quantity in terms of the number of quantities that are produced within the parameters of capitalist production, as has been outlined over the course of this book in its various terms, abstractions, theories, and illustrations. As I was reading as I was reading, as I was reading other material to make sense of chapter 17, what I came across, I forget at the moment, I forget which of the materials I'm referencing at the moment, but as I was reading some of this other stuff, I discovered that chapter 17 is a kind of a place marker in the book that obligates the reader to understand and articulate, that is to put different understandings and different concepts together within his more general historiographic and historical materialist method. Anyway, so it's a kind of, academics or professors and instructors will understand that this chapter constitutes a kind of midterm, so anyway, here is where Marx's critique of Ricardo, almost 500 pages earlier in my edition, is finally crystallized in my imagination and understanding. Where Marx critiques Ricardo and classical political economy more generally, who, as he says, fall in the commonplace error and assume the value of one commodity in order to determine the values of the rest, and where Ricardo has not investigated surplus value as such, that is, he hasn't examined it independently of its particular forms, Marx's historical materialist method provides a more comprehensive consideration of the various factors, historical circumstances, methods, means, and conditions that bear on surplus value and its constituting parts. I hope that, as I'm going about introducing this discussion in this way, I'm not, making use of too much jargon. It's just, my level of understanding of chapter 17 is anchored in the language of the book. And just as soon as I have a more complete understanding, a more complete mastery of chapter 17, I'll certainly be able to turn to non-jargonistic language and terms and understandings with which to bridge any divide that exists between us, Matt, and any divide that might exist between us and folks out there watching. Right. Yeah.
Well, what's really important for chapter 17 is to make sure you're maintaining these previously established definitions, right? So, because I remember when I first got into Marxism in my early or my mid-20s, I thought that necessary labor meant just because the way the phrase sounds and the way in English works, that necessary labor meant the amount of labor required to make something, right? But that's not what necessary labor means. That's not what it means. I mean, that's not what it means in Marx, and that's not what it means within Kapital. What necessary labor means within Kapital, within the book Kapital, for the purposes of understanding the book Kapital. Now, you can argue that that's not what the word necessary labor should mean, or what the phrase should mean. That's not what the word necessary means, and that's not what the word labor means. You can make all those semantic arguments, but in the context of what Marx is saying, to understand what Marx is saying and the definitions that he has placed forth, so that we can keep following along as he keeps drawing new conclusions. Necessary labor, what that is the amount of work you have to do in order to receive a certain amount of wages in order to live, right? That was what the necessary labor that you trade in order to survive, right? That is what that means. And surplus is like this kind of stuff that's taken out of that, is above and beyond, right? And so what gets confusing here is he starts talking about the required labor, right, or the labor requirements of something, and then so much. When there's an advance in kind of technology, there's advance in just productive methods. It doesn't necessarily mean a new machine came in, just like somebody figured something out, how to better use machines, or they figured out how to better just train people, or they figured out better use. Just for whatever reason, productivity increases, right? That when they're talking about that increase in productivity, that doesn't actually affect the level of a surplus that is being pulled out of the worker in the way that Ricardo had basically predicted. Like Ricardo predicted that essentially, well, if there's less work, then if it requires less work to make something, then the value of the thing is going to go down essentially.
Yeah.
And that Marx says that's actually true, and he's got all these he's got all these numbers to back up why. I mean, like the numbers. I'll be honest with myself. The numbers, of the equations are kind of a mystery to me too. So I just tend to take his word.
Yeah.
A calculator and try and travel back in time and see if his what do you call it, his estimations of the amount of workers who are in a factory or the amount of raw materials were there. But it's like, okay, I'm not going to check whether or not he's right about the amount of textiles or grains of rice or whatever it is we're looking at. But yeah, no, it is very complicated. But when you keep in mind that what necessary labor means, what surplus labor means, what surplus value means, and then to understand that now he's talking about increases in productivity and how why it doesn't change. So it seemed like it would change, but he's saying that. I mean, here it is. I mean, instead of me trying to explain, I'll just read it. Is that since the working day is a constant in magnitude and is represented by value of constant magnitude, since every variation magnitude of surplus value, there corresponds an inverse variation of the value of labor power. And since the value of labor power cannot change except in the consequence of a change in productiveness of labor, it clearly follows that under these conditions that every change in magnitude and surplus value arises from an inverse change in magnitude of labor power. If then, as we've already seen, there can be no change of absolute magnitude of labor power and surplus value unaccompanied by change in their relative magnitudes, so it follows that no changes in their relative magnitudes is possible without a previous change in the absolute magnitude of the value of labor power.
These are long sentences. These are long sentences that require reading and reading. You've got to get them a clause at a time, a clause at a time, a clause at a time. Right. Juggle different clauses within a single sentence very carefully in order to understand the meaning of that sentence. Mm-hmm. And that's only a part of a larger idea. You know, that's the difficulty. That's the difficulty. Throughout the numerous months, I'll take it up, Matt.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Throughout the numerous months and chapters that we have been dedicating to Kapital, we have explained, illustrated, and discussed this concept, right? This concept of surplus value that we just, that you just addressed at this moment now, Matt. We have explained, illustrated, and discussed this concept from time to time. Thus, we understand that necessary labor and surplus labor as historical realities are constitutive and integral to surplus value in ways that the classical economy that Marx summarizes in chapter 1 fails to do. Thus, in chapter 17, Marx takes up the task to review the way that the dialectical divide between the value of labor power, i.e., the wear and tear, as he writes, that is contained in commodities and that is gauged in relation to currency and cost to capital, and surplus value, which is the difference between the total value created in one unit of time and the value of labor power in that same unit of time. Thus, the variety of combinations of time, exercise, and quantity that Marx reviews in this chapter serve first to explain and illustrate his general method, and second, distinguish his more comprehensive and historical economy from classical and what he determines to be myopic political economy.
Right.
What he does.
I'm sorry.
No,
So
no,
the
go
labor,
ahead.
the the paragraph down, he says the value of labor power is determined by the value of a given quantity of necessaries. Right. So what is an what? See, this one I can translate. Right. The value of labor power is determined by the value of a given quantity of necessaries. So what he's saying is, so what is labor power? Labor power is your ability to work, right? Your skills and ability to do a thing within in capitalism, within a commercial setting, within some type of capital relationship. Your ability to do a thing, that's your labor power, right? It's determined by the value of a given quantity of necessaries. What are necessaries? Necessaries are kind of the stuff of a society, right? So like you might think like, well, a phone is not necessary, whereas an apple might be a necessary because um, you're thinking in terms of like what do you actually need to live and survive and stuff like that. And there's a grand truth to that, and people need to stop focusing on all these little stupid things and items that we have in society. It's a grand truth. That is not what is meant by necessary. Both an apple and a phone would be necessary in today's society,
Yeah.
right? So it's stuff of society. It's the stuff that you get by in the world that we live in, right? So those are necessaries. So it'd be like the value of your labor power is determined by the value of a given quantity of necessary. So it'd be like the value of your work, what is your work worth is determined um, by what the things that the place you work for makes, right? It is a value and not the mass of the necessary. So it is what you're bringing and not the total amount of stuff that varies within the productiveness of labor. So it's what you're bringing to the table that is the variable, right? So it's not necessarily the machines are the constant, the resources are the constant, the ability to make these things are the constant. What the variable is the value that you are bringing to this, because you're the sole source of value. You're the sole source of you're the variable. It is, however, possible, owing to an increase in productiveness, both labor and capitalists may simultaneously be able to appropriate a greater quantity of those necessaries without a change in the price of labor power or in surplus value. So it's possible, though, that like you may end up, even though there is an increase, you're both able to appropriate. You're both able to make more of these things. You're both able to get a hold of some stuff without a change in the price of labor power, meaning your wages. Or in the amount of surplus value being wrenched out of you, right? So things can be rare. So like, for instance, right? So like if you make, let's say you make Nikes in the United States, right? You're gonna be able to pay some people a certain amount of money, and to work here. But you're not gonna be able to sell Nikes for $1,000. You're still gonna be able to sell them for a high price, but you're never gonna be able to do that. But you can go to Indonesia and make them over there, and you can pay people. You can underpay them. You can grossly underpay them, and you can make. You're still going to sell it at this price. So the amount of surplus value has greatly increased, doing the same amount of work. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what he's saying, but I mean that's just one example we can think of in our modern times. How the amount just simply because there's not a 1-to-1 ratio. There's nothing written in the stars that a capitalist has to abide by a certain mathematical percentage about the amount of surplus labor they wrench out of their workers.
Yeah. Well, in keeping with the principal divide between him and classical economists, in the sense that where perhaps they do political economy and he does historical economy, right? Such that he is attentive to the general modes of production and its methods, right? Marx is making use of terms and understandings that he has developed over the preceding chapters that are useful here again for us to understand the distinctions. In other words, and to be a little bit more specific, there are standards in production, and there are things that haven't been standardized in capitalist production, and these things are a consequence of historical events, right? And so Marx uses the term constant and the other term variable, right? And so to the extent that a capital is constant, what he terms constant capital, right? It's to that extent that the capitalist class has framed and contained and controlled, right, these factors within the chains of production in the systems of capitalist production. And to the extent that things are variable, that is, that to the extent that capital investments are variable, it's to that extent, right, that the capitalist class hasn't had the hasn't been able to monopolize, right, these particular factors within the chains of capitalist production. And so we know these terms from things that we have read in the past. Marx makes use of these terms again in chapter 17, right? And in so doing, helps us to make sense of the more particular instances of a capitalist production that he frames, again by way of his attention to time, exercise, and quantity, right? By way of his attention to the length of the working day in terms of the hours, the intensity of labor, right? And the number of commodities, that is the quantity of commodities that are produced within a given segment of time of production. And so what Marx does is he lists 4 possible combinations within this, within capitalist production, attentive to these various combinations. The first one, what I'll do is I will identify the 4 combinations that Marx addresses, and then I will explain. I'll explain 1, maybe 2 of these combinations, and then by that point we should be heading towards the tail end of our discussion, Matt. And then, we'll begin to wrap it up, because I don't think we'll have time for a discussion of the 4 combinations. So the first combination is the length of the working day and the intensity of labor are both constant, though the productiveness of labor is variable. The second combination that Marx identifies in chapter 17 is that the working day is constant, the productiveness of labor is constant, though the intensity of labor is variable. The third combination is that the productiveness of labor is constant, the intensity of labor is constant, though the length of the working day is variable. And then finally, the fourth combination is that there are simultaneous variations in the duration, productiveness, and intensity of labor. So these are the four combinations, Matt, that Marx addresses in chapter 17. Before I get into one of these, is there anything that you want to bring up?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said yes. I'm sorry. Okay, perfect. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to address the first one, right? Which is the length of the working day is constant, the intensity of labor is constant, though the productiveness of labor is variable. Remember, right, that these are, constancy and variability are historical markers and a consequence of the general modes of capitalist production in history. And in preceding sessions and discussions that we've had throughout the last, 8 months, we've addressed, right, how it is that either force or technology are the, as Marx says, are the midwives, right, of one historical moment and transition into another historical moment. And so let's, if we keep that in mind, we will understand why the length of the working day can be standardized, can be conformed and contained as constant, so too the intensity of labor, and why the productiveness of labor may or may not be variable, may or may not be constant. Another thing that is important to recognize is that within this frame of capitalist production, the combinations bear either on the magnitude of surplus value, and for that matter, also on the value of labor power. Okay, so these are the end results, if you will, and these depend on these independent factors, as we might say. Length of the working day is constant, intensity of labor is constant, and the productiveness of labor is variable. What he's doing here then is laying out a mathematical formula for gauging the product. As I was thinking about these particular equations, I was thinking, what might we call the end result? If these are algorithms, if these are equations, if these are algebraic formulas, if these are multiplications even, what might we call the end result? And in terms of, at that abstract theoretical level, of course, we use the word product, right? So that 4 is the product of 2 times 2. 6 is a product of 2 times 3. And then it's interesting because the same word product, right, is useful to understand these relationships at the most empirical, historical, and practical level, right? That this pencil, right,
Yeah.
is itself a product of preceding combinations of relationships between labor and capital. So it is a product as a mathematical, it's the product of a mathematical equation, and it's the product of historical relationships in the economy. Go ahead.
So I like to begin anytime we talk about like kind of these more complex things, always starting with like, even though like we don't see it that we don't see as much of it, or it's not as big a definer of our current economy. But when we're looking at what Marx is talking about, always start with talking about commodity production, like the production of a commodity, right? Working on the assembly line of a commodity, of a product, because when we start talking about service work, when we start talking about, I know that we talk about education a lot,
yeah.
it becomes more abstract, right? And it's not to say that we shouldn't do that, but let's start with the commodity production because that's what's more concrete, that's what's easier, and then from there to jump to doing the more abstract, the greater abstractions. Otherwise, if you jump from abstraction to abstraction, it's just so we're talking about when you talk about this, what is the end result of what he's talking about? He's talking about the fact that like if you found a better way to make that pen, see, because you can't just look at these things and like he's just saying this. There's this new meme, these memes and things that are very popular that says absolutely no one, and then someone will be like singing in the middle of a fountain for no reason. You know what I'm saying? Like it'll be like absolutely nobody. So it's like apropos nothing, right?
Yeah.
These statements are not apropos nothing. I mean, when he says these things, it's not apropos nothing. It's not him just explaining the universe. It's not him staring at the stars. It's not him looking to try and figure out how does this thing really work. He's writing this in response to that which would discredit his general thesis, right? So the general thesis that like, you go to work, you're exploited, and what you bring to the table is the only variable. Like everything else is fixed. Everything else is figured out. You're the one that can shut this down. Like that machine's not going to shut it down. The manager, like he's probably not going to shut it down.
Yeah.
The dirt is not going to shut it down. The materials pulled out of the dirt is not going to shut it down. If you're working with like farm animals, they're not going to shut it down. What's going to shut it down is you, right? So you're the variable. And so like that's kind of that's the general thesis of what Marx is saying, is that we as workers with our ability to work, with our labor power, have the ability to shut down this whole thing with commodity production and seize the means of production and produce things and reshape society with the different, the whole different economy and whole different set of politics, right? So that's the general thesis. But like people will say, well, okay, well, what if things are improved in production? What if production becomes more safe? What if production happens quicker? What if this? What if this? What if that? So these people will say, on the basis of the shifts in production, that somehow everything has changed. So he's writing this. He's writing all of this to say that no, a shift in production is not going to change the basic relationship between capitalist and worker. So that's the whole purpose of even writing this, right? So we have to consider the reason, what calls forth chapter 17. Why is he writing this, right? Because so much of his writing is in response to people who try and nitpick and find a way to attack the general thesis, not nitpick on little different things here and there. Right. Maybe he's wrong, maybe he got a number off or this or that, and I'm sure he did. I mean, you can't write that much and not get one or two facts wrong. Yeah. But it's not nitpicking on that. It's like any little nitpick to destroy the entire thesis, right? And why would they try and destroy the entire thesis? Is it because they're intellectually curious? Of course not. Trying to destroy the entire thesis because their salaries and careers, which are based upon the explanation of the economic system as a social good, depend upon it.
And their role in propping up the system, right? Facilitating the exploitation. In effect, these are the spokespersons of the banking class.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Right. So these people are like Thomas Friedman today, or Paul Krugman, or a number of these mainstream economists that you see get lifted up and where. And some of them may be more draconian than others. Maybe like Thomas Friedman might be an example of some very draconian. Obviously Milton Friedman. I mean, that was a really big one. You have people like Jeffrey Sachs, but even the ones that are so-called liberal left, like Robert Reich, like people like that. They're there. They hold the position they hold in order to justify the economy that we have, right? Even if they're talking about tweaking it, even if they're talking about making it more fair, even if they're talking about people like we shouldn't let people starve in the street kind of thing. Maybe they genuinely believe that in their heart of hearts, and they do have a genuine compassion for their fellow human beings and don't want to see people suffer. Maybe that's true, but the position they hold in society is to justify why it is that there's a world wherein people are exploited. That to justify where now they may be arguing about what the rate of exploitation should be. Right, so that's what a lot of Bernie Sanders, AOC, all that kind of stands for. It's like we're arguing about the rate of exploitation. Like you shouldn't be able to pay your workers. Amazon workers should be making at least $30 an hour. Amazon, if your company is like making this much money, or Amazon workers should make at least $15 an hour, or $20 an hour, or whatever they're arguing. Right, they're not arguing about Jeff Bezos' right to the surplus value of his workers. They're arguing about what that ratio should be.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that is similar to someone like Ricardo. I have to look at what Ricardo was saying, but honestly, a lot of those people, even from ranging from the more draconian, more just get back to work, types, to people who are more compassionate, or at least seeming more compassionate. We're really not arguing about. What we're arguing about is a rate of profit being wrenched out of the worker, opposed to the entire relationship. So, what Karl Marx was arguing was that the entire relationship between capitalists and workers should be abolished, and that the role of the capitalist itself should be abolished. Yeah. That's quite different than trying to negotiate the relationship between capitalist and worker.
Yeah. It's the critique that you are leveling is well received and well stated, I think, because, in fact, I know, because what contemporary liberal and even left of center economists and philosophers and others that are looking at the systems of of contemporary capitalist production, one of the things that I see them doing is in terms of softening the oppression that is landed upon workers, in terms of softening the exploitation that is exercised upon working people. They are anchoring themselves in Keynesian compromises between labor and capital. In fact, they're even addressed here in this book. Of course, Keynesian economics as a thing is something that surfaces in the 20th century, well after Marx is dead and buried, and well after, of course, the book is published. But in any case, that there's this attempt to soften oppression, attempt to alleviate exploitation without, as you say, Matt, and of course as Marx outlines in Capital, without destroying the system altogether. A kind of compromise, right, between labor and capital, where still labor gets the short end of the stick. And to the extent,
between labor and capital, labor will always get the short end of the stick because the existence of capital is
Yes.
the exploitation of labor.
Yes.
And it isn't anything else. I mean, so you got to really understand that the existence of capital is the exploitation of labor.
Yeah, it's the myopic understanding of the economy, the myopic understanding of history that would allow labor to see that this compromise is within its advantage. Absolutely, right? It's this myopic understanding of these large epics in history, these large transformations in history, and the role of the oppressing classes, or rather the oppressing class, vis-a-vis the working class. Absolutely, absolutely. These are fundamental.
Right, and so you would have in say like a socialist system, right? In under and with an industrial means of with an industrial like means of production, would essentially be labor and management, but you wouldn't have capital. Capital would not exist, right? And then it just simply would not exist because then it would be socialism. You would have essentially would be labor and management. I mean, management would be like the government. I mean, like you can argue like what should the relationship between that? So there still could be like there's still some tension between that.
Yeah.
What government salary should be, for instance, and like why is the mayor making 4 times more than blah 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 blah. Yeah. You still have these questions, right? You still have possibility of corruption. You still have possibility of all kinds of things, right? Just because socialism isn't like the production of like rainbows and beautiful new day. It's not it's not utopia. It's utopia. It's not heaven on earth. It's not paradise on earth.
Yeah.
And but it's not capital. It's not what it is the absence of a group of people who are parasitically living off everyone else.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because the government official still has to go and work every day. Government officials still has to go and do their job and do the whatever, blah 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 blah, and be a functioning member of this general society you have. Right, that's what happens in socialism. And you can argue that you end up with corruption, you end up with this, you end up with this, and people are living alcohol, shit like that. Yeah, of course, but that's not the same, right? That's not the same. And so when we talk about capital versus labor, when we talk about what it means to be a Marxist, what it means to be socialist, what it means to be communist, is for the abolition of capital, not to improve the relationship between labor and capital.
Yeah.
Because capital is the exploitation of labor.
Yes. Thus, and to take us back to this combination, thus if the length of the working day is constant, but the productiveness of labor is variable, then the value produced is spread across the quantity of the quantity of commodities produced.
Companies.
In this case, a rise in value of labor power has an opposite effect in the magnitude of surplus value. When he's talking about magnitude of surplus value, I think it's important to pause here and to distinguish between surplus value as one term and magnitude of surplus value as a separate, though related, certainly very related term. It's just, and of course, I'm going to try to get to this distinction towards the conclusion portion of our discussion. But for now, what I'd like to say is that certainly surplus value is that value extracted that value extracted by capital from the working classes above and beyond the necessary labor that the laboring classes submit to the capitalist class. But then there's this other term, magnitude of surplus value. In other words, there is surplus value that can be obtained in one day and surplus value that can be lost in a second day, but over the course of numerous days within a frame of time, right? Capital will take some losses within divisions of time, but knowledgeable of the fact that overall, right, the magnitude of surplus value will be great. So it'll compromise with labor. It will surrender to the variability of labor, right? Knowing that down the road, it will standardize labor, standardize production in such a way that it will be able to take more from labor than it surrenders, over a period of time, and so that the magnitude of surplus value is greater down the road, right? And so I just, I wanted to mention this because it is capital's more expansive and comprehensive understanding of capitalist relations to the ignorance of those of us who have a myopic understanding of history, those of us who have a myopic understanding of relationships between capital and labor. It's to capital's advantage then that we focus on a particular segment of time and keep ourselves within that segment of time so that they can continue to work the system over the long haul to their advantage. If you've seen those charts, those diagrams, right? The XY diagrams where the arrow is pointing up, and certainly at some point, the arrows take a notch down, but generally, right, the rates of exploitation, generally the rates of surplus value extraction, and ultimately the magnitude of surplus value, right, obtained by capital is on an upswing. So no change can take place in the absolute magnitude without a simultaneous change in the relative magnitudes, i.e. relative to each other. Of course, he's talking about surplus value. What I'd like to do at this point is just quickly say, under these circumstances, therefore, right, as he says, no change can take place in the absolute magnitude either of the surplus value or the value of labor power without a simultaneous change in their relative magnitudes, relatively to each other. It is impossible for them to rise or fall simultaneously. I think that this is a contradiction that I'd like to address in a little bit.
But I would argue that a lot of what he was describing may have been true then. I mean, we're talking about the fact that these things are going to rise and fall simultaneously. These things have a relationship. They're not bound up by. They're not absent of the will of the capitalist or the worker. I mean, they can still. You're not bound by numbers here. But I would say that in our time, since the late 1970s, something qualitatively different has happened than just a productive increase. I mean, we're looking at the beginning stages of the collapse of an industrial world order, of an industrial means of production. We're looking at the beginning of that collapse into something where human beings are not necessary to produce commodities, are not necessary to move the products. I mean, you can have automated truck drivers, you have automated trains. They're becoming less and less necessary for service kind of things. You have automated cashiers, so on and so forth. Now, these technologies exist and they're implemented haphazardly. They're implemented. They're not implemented in a way that's what it's like. They're not implemented in a coordinated fashion because, I mean, obviously, capitalists, they're in competition with one another, so they don't necessarily coordinate their efforts all the time. I mean, at times they do, like cartels, but other times they don't. They just kind of just do what they do, And so, but these technologies, many of them exist, and so we're in the beginning stages of their rollout, of their implementation. And that is going to become something completely different. But even without them being coordinatedly released into the ecosphere of production, even without their general release, we have still seen the effects of this being unleashed upon on the world. I mean, just keeping in the United States, since '78, you look at like the amount of the workers' productivity has gone up, and yet wages have remained flat, and profits have soared, and simultaneously you look at the social, you look at like the social, what's going on in society. Prison rates have skyrocketed, homelessness has skyrocketed, the cost of going to college has skyrocketed, personal debt has skyrocketed. All these things have happened absent the fact that, because it is so difficult to sell your labor power. Because, like the fact that what makes you proletariat is your necessity to sell your labor power. What makes this period a little different is the difficulty to sell your labor power. That's a different proposition. But what is today difficulty will become impossibility as these things keep further, as this process further and further unfolds. I mean, Marx is describing the rise of capital, but this takes centuries. We're like maybe like 40 years deep into this thing. As this thing unfolds, what today is difficult will tomorrow be impossible.
Yeah.
And I think there's something different happening. I don't think we can look at like what he's describing, saying like, well, if we look at our own time, we see this, and we see that wages have remained flat, and profits have gone up, and productivity is going up, and we're not getting paid more.
That would be my open on our part.
That proves what he's saying. I think something different. I think something beyond what he was saying is now happening, not because he was wrong, but because conditions have changed.
Okay. All right. I want to ask you, but at the same time, I want to get through chapter 17. So maybe we can talk about it in our next discussion, or maybe in exchange that follows this this session. Under these conditions, the value of labor power falls relative to the increase of surplus value when there is a rise in the productiveness of labor. In other words, if the day is as long as it is standard, rather, if the day is as long as is standard, if the quantity of labor is as intense as is standard, but the output of commodities fluctuates, there can only be elevated levels of surplus value, which means that the value of labor power falls, if labor elevates its production. Effectively, what Marx the economist does is link his appropriation of Ricardian economics, which is an economics that examines the preceding formulas for arriving at the value of labor power relative to surplus value, and fit these formulas within historical conditions that, from Marx's take, investigate surplus value independently of its particular forms, such as profit, rent, etc. I'd like to, at this point, it's going to be impossible to talk about the second combination. What I'd like to do is I'd like to gear us towards the conclusion at this point, Matt, and turn it over to you for poetry afterward. Is that okay? All right. I cannot hear you. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So the historiographic possibility available to those informed by Marx's historical materialist method are multiple. Two come immediately to mind. Consideration of the magnitude of surplus value as such opens the possibility to fit, and this is the first one, opens the possibility to fit subunits of time within a more general unit of time, and thus fit the conflict, tensions, and negotiations between labor and capital within the scope of the outcomes within that time frame. And this brings me to point two. The historical materialist method recognizes that the conflict, tensions, and negotiations between labor and capital, the dialectics in history, fit in their respective and broad segments of time, and that the magnitudes of surplus value at each segment of time and the dialectics within them can be used to distinguish one from the other. Consider the understanding of Keynesian economics, where productiveness of labor is variable, where increased productivity elevates income for labor and surplus value for capital. In the larger history of capitalism, this is as transitory as the subunits of time are within the Keynesian unit of capitalist time. In other words, within capitalist time, Keynesian compromises have only been transitory, and we might draw the sort of comparisons between the containment and control of labor today with that of pre-Keynesian labor, as those who recognize the imprisonment today is not entirely unlike 19th century enslavement in the US. Or for that matter, those who in the mid-20th century were excluded from Keynesian-based compromises with capital might be thoughtfully compared and understood in relation to shared experiences of primitive accumulation in other centuries and geographies. Talking in this last case, I'm literally talking about, forms of brutal primitive accumulation that was taking place in Europe, for instance, in the 16th century, where people are thrown off the land, where cartels, mafias take over land and overproduction in these geographies, right? And then peasants become proletarians. It happened in Europe in the 16th century. It happened in Colombia. It's been happening in Colombia over the last, it's been happening in what is now Colombia over the last 500 years, but very visibly and explicitly to our eyes over the last 40 years. It's certainly happening in central Mexico and Central America today, in northern Mexico, and Standing Rock today. Matt.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that the question of proletarization in the American Southwest, I mean, it's really it's really a brilliant kind of case study. It's really just obvious. Really, a lot of these things that he points out clearly happen. One way of life just being destroyed for another. But again, that's an age-old story of industry versus agriculture. I mean, it's always going to take that form. So even when you look at something as industry being let's say something better. I don't even like the word progressive, but just something better, right? Yeah. Than what it's supplanting. For instance, the U.S. Civil War, right? It's still going to take that kind of. It's still going to come head to head like that, And but what I think we're looking at is, I think that chapter of history, which is still taking place all over the world, is we're looking at our setting, in our urban settings here in the United States. It's something a new conflict, which is that of like, which is really kind of the world being built around the microchip, the world being built upon around the obsolescence of your labor, of your labor power becoming obsolete.
Yeah.
And where is this all headed? Is an open question. I think that the necessity of seizing the means of production, which was what to do in industry, that doesn't change. I mean, saying like, fighting industry would be very Luddite, but the idea isn't to like fight the industry, the idea is to seize it. And so today, the idea would not be to fight automation, but rather to seize hold of it. But the fact that it's happening, and the fact that it's coming, and the fact that someone could like, again, like Marx, like Karl Marx, who just have enemies who would nitpick this happening. Today, it would be the Marxists themselves who would nitpick what I'm saying right now and be like, well, look at this, and look at these factories here, and look at this, and look at that. I mean, look at your own life. Your own life has been defined by the fact that this shit's been happening for the last 40 years. I mean, your own life. The fact that, your parents had 2 jobs and you've had 8. I mean, that is speaks to like what's happening here. The fact that like if you're around my age, I mean, the fact that you've had to have so many different careers, the fact that this is gone from what was said to be the industrial economy to the service economy to the gig economy. And what's going to replace the gig economy? Because gig economy is just as transient as a service economy was, or whatever the hell that was. And so this is all moving in one direction. And so I think that people need to be really cognizant of that.
I was texting a friend from my childhood the other evening, and we were back and forth, checking up on one another. I haven't seen him in decades, but we discovered one another, and we text each other from time to time. He informs me. He texted me to inform me. He texted to see how I was doing and to tell me that he's COVID positive, that his wife is COVID positive, that his mother-in-law is COVID positive. And he shares with me, he says, he said to me, I wear a mask all the time. He says, but my wife has 3 jobs and she takes care of her mother. What kind of society, what kind of society do we live in such that that's normal? You know that I'm a professor. I work at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and often I hear my students complain about the fact that in addition to coming to school full time, they have a full-time job and a part-time job, and they are the mothers, of children who they drop off with their own mothers for childcare. Some folks have 3 jobs and go to school. What kind of society do we work in? What kind of society do we live in that this is normal?
Yeah.
Some kind of poetic closure.
Sure. Yeah, here we go. So on that note, so it's called King of Los Angeles. Head to glass, faded hand, groundless souls. To the one ways, the one days, the dead ends, and failed beginnings of downtown Los Angeles. When moving at the right speed, it is easy to reimagine yourself king. Map out the geography. Claim principality where money stacks so high seems like it belongs to everyone. It doesn't. Early dawn. Restless feet shuffle hand-paved streets. The centuries of industry march to the next. When man, penniless, says to me, just my 2 cents. The fight is fixed. The game is rigged in the house. Well, the house always wins, which line you'll never find me reduced to knees, bowed, crouched, cry out to not-for-profit personal Lord and Savior, licking the boots of chant to him some long-dead founding fathers or long-dead founding charters or citing the sacred trust of our hallowed institutions. They own the courts, the church, and the Constitution. They are steel. We are flesh. They are the law. We are not them, but you. You actually believe in the things that keep you fed. The world spins. The light of day off the cityscape to my still waking eye. And its cruel walk to the park. But a cool breeze off the pond, gold teeth, gold rings, retiree says to me, have a seat. Here's the first thing. In this game, there are players, there are pawns, and neither escapes the clock. And you, yes, you the fool, I could read you in less than 4 moves. Open hands, closed eyes, open chest, exposed neck. The charmer of hostile snakes. You place your faith in hopes of future embrace this world of exchange with no guarantees, only hunger's defeat. Watch as they scramble like ducks at the sight of a few crumbs. Lungs have their limits, power is for the taking, strength is for survival. Very best is he who bury last, and freedom is a battle cry of a man prepared to die. Son, I do not believe you have it in you. And I remembered standing before lights flashing in the shadows of mansion, why lie? I was broken. The law of the land, somewhere between the mountains and the ocean. Driver, carry me tonight. Poison drives the steel. Money steals the time. Pockets and scars for the city's exhausted cynics, critics, misers, drivers, and the pride of men. So it is here in this concrete sea of indifference that I make my confession that sometimes I imagine I and I alone with the power fixes me. Yes, me, the king of Los Angeles, for none could make it alone, but together they could not stop us. Night falls. The city speaks. The city breathes words simple and complete. Your money or your life. Why lie? My life. My life. I was born free and penniless. And just like you, they've been robbing me ever since.
Well, there is grammar, there are equations, there are formulas and algorithms to talk about these things, abstract as they are. And then there is the concreteness of our lives, from which poetry can be developed, written, and can serve to bridge, the divide between what is out there and our individual eyes, what is out there and our hearts and our mind. I think your work helps to bridge these things very well. I like it for these reasons. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Chingón. Gracias.